Okay, welcome. So, this is a practice, teaching practice I developed at NYU. I was teaching, I went to NYU in 2002 to develop a BS in Information Systems Management. But I had a background in economics, and there was so much talent in New York City that I decided to hire a lot of good talent for the upper level classes, and I decided to teach a couple of the economic classes. So as I began to teach, economics is, you know, they have these big textbooks, you know, Krugman, Mankyo, all these really large macroeconomics books, and it was difficult, it was boring, just lecturing constantly. So I developed this simulation that would have students become Fed presidents. And we would do a simulation of the Federal Reserve and the FOMC, which is the Federal Open Market Committee. They're the ones that set the interest rates. So this presentation, so I'll look at you know, how it is that I developed the simulation, some of the objectives, the logistics, and do it within the context in which I constantly sort of developed the simulation, and that is within Bloom, the educational taxonomy of Bloom, and a lot of the education people here are quite familiar with that. It's been around for a while. It's pretty established, maybe a little bit old-fashioned. And also rules of play, which at the time I was also developing a game program at NYU. So I was integrating some ideas from there. So I had done my master's thesis and my PhD on electronic money, so it wasn't that new of a topic for me, and I always felt that money should have a more central focus in teaching economics. You'd think that it would, but all these books that I mentioned, they don't start with money until chapter 31, 32, 33. So I always brought those chapters forward, and I decided to develop a simulation. So in rules of play, particularly there's a focus on meaningful play, what I tend to call serious play, but it's really looking at this relationship between player actions and the outcomes that result in a successful game experience. And so it's really designing those actions where they make choices and affect the progress of the game, or in this case the simulation, and then the outcome. So here's my class at NYU, here at SUNY, doing the simulation. At NYU I was a little lucky, I only had classes of about 15 people usually, so we were able to just have one, but I developed this simulation now to incorporate multiple groups. I also, going back, I used it in a microeconomics class, managerial economics really, when I was teaching in the MBA program at St. Edward's in Austin, Texas. I moved there a couple years ago after I left NYU. Here's just briefly kind of overview of Bloom's taxonomy. So cognitive, intellectual capability, knowledge, thinking, but also the affective domain, the actual sort of feeling, emotions, behavioral, getting a feel. So as the students become Fed presidents, they look up the bio, they really try to, in the beginning, kind of become a Fed president. I actually had them switch over to their own personalities ultimately when we actually have to do more decisions, but getting them into the affect, the feelings, the behaviors of a Fed president, and then some of the psychomotor activities, so actually talking and presenting and interacting with each other, doing research. So some of the simulation goals are really to understand the role of money in the economy, understand the banking system, and particularly the fractional reserve banking system, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Understand how the Federal Reserve, the FOMC, targets interest rates through its open market operations. Recognize the value limitations of national accounting measurements, such as national income and GDP. Develop an understanding of what causes economic growth. Learn how inflation and deflation emerge within the economy. Grasp the implications of government spending. Understand how Fed actions influence the value of the dollar. And learn the distinction between printing money and increasing the money supply. It's always one of my pet peeves is when people talk about printing money, which some societies do, but the Federal Reserve is a bit more sophisticated in that it buys bonds with a kind of magical credit card in order to put money into the economy. But it also, now it's sitting with about $4.5 trillion on their balance sheets of different types of assets. A lot of those are those toxic mortgages that they bought up during the housing crisis. But they have the ability now to sell them off at bargain rates, but that will suck up money from the economy and is meant to be a hedge against inflation. So just introduction to the Fed. So you have the Board of Governors headed by the chair, Janet Yellen, the different Federal Reserve banks, the FOMC committee, and then all the banks that are part of the Federal Reserve. There's probably a better representation. Starting up there in the right hand corner of the Boston Fed, New York, stretching out across the country to the San Francisco Fed. Why do you think the number 12, the San Francisco Fed is so much larger? Includes Hawaii and Alaska.
It looks like the judicial district of that whole zone. Is it related? No, just by accident.
Not so much judicial.
But I mean, that's an equally huge circuit court.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure maybe for some of the same reasons, but the Federal Reserve was created in 1912, 1314, and it somewhat represents the wealth of the time. And so the wealth was much more aggregated on the East Coast, and so it was more concentrated. So it made more sense. There was more economic activity. I heard also that it took longer for trains, transportation to bring in people from the West Coast. So they didn't want to have as many people having to make that trip. So anyway. But that gives you some idea. And it's one of the reasons why I continued here at SUNY Korea to use the simulation, because it's a good introduction to the U.S. for the students as well. They become presidents of each of those areas, like Kansas City. They have to do a lot of research on the economic activities of that area. So they learn about, if it's Kansas City, all the agriculture and...
I don't want to interrupt, but you answered my question already. It's interesting. So you have 12 different chairs of different regional areas, and they talk to each other and try to coordinate. Is this part of the game itself? Or?
Yes. So ultimately, the objective would be at the end to set interest rates. And I'll explain that a little bit more. But so there's a couple of ways of doing that. And they're listed there. So reserve requirements is, the reserve is basically requiring the banks to hold a certain amount a certain percentage of their deposits in reserve, either at the Fed or in their own vaults. The discount window is it's an opportunity for banks to go to the Fed to borrow money. But if you notice, that interest rate is quite a bit higher than the Fed funds rate. And it's the Fed funds rate which is the main focus of the FOMC, and so then our simulation as well. Quantitative easing was just all the buying that they did of a lot of toxic debt, the mortgages, things like that, in order to really get us out of that recession that we were in. So 12 members, the FOMC sets the monetary policy, sets the target for the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds market, okay, this is part of why it gets a little complicated, is a rate at which banks borrow from each other overnight via FedWire to lend at a higher rate. So maybe it doesn't have to get that complicated. It is a totally electronic system. It's probably the most secure electronic system in the world. It moves about $3.5 to $4 trillion a day. It's a lot of money moving through their system. But overnight, banks borrow from each other in order to make loans, or to refresh their balances so they can they don't have to call back any loans. So it's this electronic system, and so what the FOMC does, when you hear that they set the interest rate, which is now, as I just showed, about 0.75 to 1%. That is what banks have to charge each other to lend to each other overnight. And the Fed intervenes just about every morning at about 9:20, 9:30 to keep that target at roughly 0.75, or slightly less than 1%. So it's not something that is mandated. It is something that is actually managed by traders. Here's an old image I threw in of the FedWire back in 1925. FedWire was primarily developed for clearing checks.
Is this a telegraph line? What is the
Yeah, it's basically telegraph lines.
Okay.
Telex, still telegraph lines. 25. So the trading desk is located at the New York Fed. So part of the advantage of being in New York was that we would go down to the Fed. We weren't actually allowed to see these operations, but we could go down into the vaults and touch a couple $100 billion of gold if we wanted to. So it was a good experience as well. I didn't actually, my students, they were primarily the sort of computer support network administrators for banks and other institutions. They weren't quants, but it was important for them to have a good feel of the Fed and the banking system. So the FOMC buys and sells U.S. government securities from 19 primary dealers. So this is like Barclays or Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, 19 countries that they primarily work with. And to be one of these primary dealers, they have to agree to buy at auction and become what economists call market makers. They have to be able to buy and sell with the other banks. That's part of the way that the system works. And this kind of simple equation here. So if the FOMC decides to buy bonds from the primary dealers, right? They purchase, that increases the bank reserves, right? Because if you purchase cash goes into the system, right? So then the banks have more money. That means they don't have to borrow from the Fed funds rate. They don't have to borrow overnight. So the demand is reduced for the Fed funds rate, and so the interest rates come down. So one of the key things about the simulation is that students really do get a feel for the logic of the market, supply and demand, because that certainly operates here. So if they want to increase interest rates, then they'll sell. Like I was just saying, they're holding about $4.5 trillion of different types of bonds, but they kind of want to get rid of. That process of selling those bonds will draw money from the banks. Mm-hmm. Banks will be less likely to borrow from the Fed funds, and so the rate will decrease. That's really, in a nutshell, the primary logic that we have to deal with. And it's not overly complicated, but it's good for students to sort of think through that process.
So how are there tokens in this game or written instructions, or how do you explain, quote, the rules, end quote, or what tools they have to use? And how do they come to that? They just talk to each other and then they vote on it, and you give sort of a bird's eye view of what may happen or not? And okay.
Yeah, I'm doing an overview right now of the Fed system, and then I will switch over to the simulation, and the simulation actually
I understand.
runs, and so that probably should run into the introduction. We're almost there. So here's kind of an example of the open market operations. The trader is meeting in the morning, talking about the economy, deciding what they're going to do. There's only really a couple minutes in the morning where they get on their computers and do the trade. In general, if something else comes up, they might be trading throughout the day. But I repeated the equation there, but these are the people that move all that money with their magic mouses, I call them. So, so we got the chair, these are the members of the committee, we have the chair, you have both the board of governors and the presidents. So some students become board of governors, not just presidents, because usually I have too many students for just the 12 bank presidents. So we take in some other people. Now, just want to mention that throughout the semester there are several actual meetings of the FOMC. So we design our exercises to occur just before the actual one, so then we have that comparison. So sometimes we have it on Tuesday, and they're meeting usually for 2 days, 8 times a year. So we're usually able to have 2, maybe 3 actual meetings that we're able to follow. And sometimes I've actually had them run and simulate more than one. It's hard to do here, because usually they start in March. The FOMC meets in March. So at least with the class here, I'm able to introduce the topic, and we at least then watch them do one, and then we have some idea of what we can do for the next one. So the 8 regular scheduled meetings, so the March, so usually it's the May one that we're able to really have a full simulation beforehand. So the actual meeting is convened by the chair. There's economic presentations. This is the actual meeting. We usually have students who are Fed presidents and Board of Governors, and they do their own presentations. So I have them do research on their areas. And
That's
so
interesting.
instead of having these people who usually present to the presidents, I have each of the students present from their areas. And then go-rounds are discussions and votes. And then Ben or Janet, and usually one of our students is named Ben or Janet, including a guy in the last MBA class that I taught. I still tease him for being called Janet. But, they get out there, they announce the results. So in terms of the actual simulation, then we have the groups, 8 to 15 students, or as you saw, sometimes I have to have 2 groups or 3. We have the chair, we have the district bank presidents, the New York Fed president and vice president. They're always involved because of the importance of the New York Fed and the Board of Governors. So the first thing that students do is they do research on each of these people. We have a hat usually that we draw from, we make it random. So they research and present the bios, and then we have something, so they present the bios, then they do research on a couple of sources, including the beige book, which is released usually about 2 weeks before the meeting, which is a report from each of the districts. And to some extent, maybe almost a little too easy, but they have to report on information from the beige book.
They copy and report on the real world data in your, that's
as
interesting.
it comes in.
Okay.
So, in the bios, though, I have them research a little bit more about the area. I have them look at a couple of newspapers from that area and talk about whether it's agriculture or manufacturing, whether it's automobiles or farming. So the simulation then begins with the chair convening. And the chair, Janet or Ben, or we may have a new person soon, review some of the key economic data, the value of the dollar, gold, different kind of indexes, GDP, key energy prices. Some of that may be covered by one of the Board of Governors. Sometimes they'll have a responsibility of covering energy, for example, or employment, things like that. And then the district banks present on their areas. The Board of Governors, so they do autos or high tech, energy, dollar. These different areas that the Board of Governors will review. And then the chair recommends policy, and the voting commences and is tallied. And then we actually even work on the press release, because the press release is very important. So they'll do the vote and they'll decide, basically, are they going to increase or decrease interest rates and by how much. So you can't see this. Anyways, it's kind of example of what the press release looks like. I don't want to strain your eyes, but basically the press release has a couple of areas. Starts with a general statement about the economy, and then looks at what they think about in terms of employment and price stability, which are the 2 areas of concern, and then they'll make some sort of statement about what they're going to do in terms of the Fed funds rate. And then usually say something about future activities, and as you see, the black on the bottom is just what they're going to do with all that debt, that $4.5 trillion of debt that they're holding. And then the votes down on the bottom. So they usually don't change that much. Some students can get in there and they can sort of change it to reflect the feelings of the FOMC, their FOMC, their group, and then we compare it a couple days later with the FOMC actual statements. And so here's the taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy again, a little bit more in depth. So knowledge, comprehension, applying knowledge, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and right into some of the things that I've learned applying that. So ultimately, why I think the simulation works. I've gotten really good feedback from it. And that's what kind of drove me to write this little book about it.
What's the title?
The Fed Watcher's Handbook. I'm going to change that. But for my students, I was trying to encouraging them to become Fed Watchers. And just before, I wrote it right after I did the MBA class. And there's a separate chapter on digital media companies and why they should follow the Fed, and what are some of the things that the Fed does that they should be paying a lot of attention to. So the summary of learning then is this learning how to decipher economic statistics, and then restating data in one's words, grasping the economic strengths and weaknesses of different parts of the U.S. I think that's why it works here in Korea, as students are often, when I teach them this course, it's before they go off to Stony Brook. Develop judgment related to economic markets, restate key geo-industry issues, research and discover different information like from the Beige Book, and anticipate the role of the Fed in financial markets. A couple more. Listening to others, articulating data-based arguments, becoming an expert, imitating the actions of the FOMC member, integrating expertise with statistical data, and the 3 rounds, constant repetition, moving the student towards an unconscious mastery of.
When you say 3 rounds, can you elaborate what you mean by?
Yes, okay, well, for my recent class, we don't do 3 rounds, but at least, we watch the FOMC the first time, then we do the simulation, and there's still a little time at the end of the semester to say, hey, did you see the results, and we discuss results, and sometimes watch the video of Jan giving the report on the FOMC meeting.
So to make sure I understand it clearly, you're saying that your class will come to a conclusion and then they watch later to see what the actual non-simulation did in the real. Okay, that's interesting. Right. Okay, yeah. So that's good anticipation, I think. It keeps them mindful about current events and ongoing dynamics. That, like, oh, they talked about this and we didn't talk about that, or that's exactly what we talked about is the reason we did that. Yeah.
Regarding this question, 2 things come up. Do they report in detail that what they really discuss? So that
yes. Yes, so the writing, they have to submit the bio that they write in the beginning. They have to submit their report on their economic area that they're reporting on. And then at the end, they do I call Fed summary and analysis. So it includes some of that other stuff, but it involves an analysis of and an understanding of what went on, and then why, especially, did they make certain decisions about interest rates, for example, and have to defend that in this final paper.
I like the give and take between the simulation and watching the real events. I mean, actually, because you're integrating real data, I think it's giving you the compliment. It's more than just a simulation. It's like a simulacra. I mean, you're really copying real world data into your model. You're not giving them artificial parameters, but you're telling them, watch what these people are doing, see if you do the exact same thing or not, and try to understand the variation. That's interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I'm excited about,
Mhm.
and why the students actually appreciate it, is that they do get a sense of,
What are the, related to that, what are the mechanisms that you have for associating real world data with the model feedback?
what are the mechanisms?
Yeah, so you can look at, you've got a model and you make a projection about what you think is gonna happen, and then it can happen or not. Do they have to look at it? Does it actually feed back into the model that they're using in class, or can they just ignore it? Is there a feedback mechanism that specifically relates to the data that they're getting from the real world back into their models?
You mean, do they improve
Yes,
their
yes.
models the next time they do it?
Do they have to specifically?
Well, if it's the end of the semester, they may not.
In the discussion, yes, and in their summary, because in their summary and analysis at the end, when they have to compare what the group did and what their own thoughts were, how they felt. I do try to sort of move them from becoming the president or board of governor into their own personality. So there's kind of a psychic switch there for them, because I don't want them to vote as the Fed president. I want them, by the time the simulation occurs, I want them to vote from their own perspective. And so I push that as well. So they are now the Fed president of Atlanta or Richmond or Dallas or something like that. And kind of forget about what the other person would do and to make their own, make their decision on their own. So, they get in there.
I have one more question. Could you give us a rough timeline? I think because this is such a tight interplay with real world events or real things you're watching, how would you organize this within a classroom environment? What is the first event? You have a lecture about, I'm going to tell you what this group realized in the real world, think about these abstracts, and then I want you to watch this or go look at those beige books. How do you build it into the team by the end where they're very comfortable with each other doing? And in terms of timeline, not just your timeline, and then you're waiting in class for this real world event to happen, and then you have a lecture after the real world event. That's kind of what I mean.
Yeah, we usually, we start off with money,
Okay.
so kind of understanding money, and so it might be a lecture discussion about what is money and what is the fractional reserve banking system. So as I said, we take chapter 31 and we move it right to the beginning.
Yeah.
And so we start off with money, and then as you saw, by mid-March, it's when they have their first meeting. So they're aware of the FOMC.
Do you assign them out of class to watch that, or do you look at it in class yourself, or what is your policy about that? How do you introduce that data into the class?
Yeah, we will discuss it.
Discussing.
Yes, depending on time, we might take a look at Janet Yellen's video of it. So, yeah, I think what I could say about it, and just apply it to some of the classes, is as you can see, this is it's organic in the sense that it's not something you can necessarily immediately apply to other classes, even though I don't want to discourage people from looking at it. I do another simulation when I teach telecommunications class on what's called if we're looking at policy, for example, the Iron Triangle in Washington, D.C. that deals with policy. And so that usually deals with Congressional and Senate subcommittee, which is where real decisions are being made. The Federal Communication Commission. So you have the Senate committee, you have the some sort of administrative, and it could be FDA or something if they're interested in food policy or something like that. And then industry involvement. So this is kind of another kind of example of a simulation. Of course, there's a lot of simulations of the United Nations, for example. So
was thinking this simulation works very well with any discipline that sets policies or standards. I mean, if that's part of the teaching, you want to teach people about how these standards for bridges or mechanical engineering came about. You might try to, have reports about different structural strengths of steel. I'm trying to think of how you could apply this simulacra of real-world data into another discipline beyond just economics. Yeah.
It seems like, especially simulations like this, pose really well for the sort of committee meeting that happens with regards to when the decision gets made. But what about for example, earlier work on at the start of the semester on money, when you have to have the students might need some background on money, or the policy making activities that go on behind the scenes before the meeting happens. Because a lot of times these meetings, everyone knows the outcomes of it prior to the event occurring, and everyone just shows up and votes the way that they expected to vote. But the sort of background stuff and the background information or knowledge building is what was really the necessary things for the study to occur. How do you bridge the relationship between that content or that activity and the classroom?
Yes. Sometimes there's some videos that I use. That's one thing that I have them do, which is different than the textbook.
But in class, though, I mean.
In class, we usually start off with some lectures, but we do quickly try to develop groups, and we assign the president the role, and then talk about it. But yes, it takes some lecturing.
Do they try to do reports of understanding these people's private backgrounds or personal? I mean, that may be way. I think you're talking about. This is the old debate in political science, about, well, voting happens in public. This is a plurality government. I don't see any conflict. Therefore we don't. And then people critique that by, oh, well, things are happening outside to set the agenda of what they talk about. And other people, these people are afraid to even bring things up and to add it to the. I mean, that's, if you're talking about policy, I think the politics side, I mean, I'm trying to think how I would do it myself in any kind of undergraduate classroom environment. It's very difficult to, unless you assign them to do kind of, political economy papers about the backgrounds of these people.
Right.
Be aware of these other things that aren't going to be talked about in a policy environment, or may not.
Right, because the issue there is that it seems to work in sort of two directions. One is that it seems to work well if you have extremely sort of limited information, where you can sort of go through the practice within one class period and be able to enact and play act given a set amount of stuff. It's very didactic, it's very artificial, but at the same time it allows you to go through a lot of the decision-making processes in a short amount of time. But and on the other end, you've got the opportunity to blow it out as close as you can, like you're saying, to the real thing, and have all of the reports align and beeline toward making a decision as the policymakers would have made it. It's this sort of in-between area that becomes the most difficult.
It kind of sets up an interesting learning culture, because they may be dissatisfied with this pedagogical tool itself, but they want to learn more about it. I mean, so they'll follow these people in their private time. I mean, the situ is, well, they may come to this conclusion like, well, this is interesting. They made a meeting, we did this in class. There's other things that they don't want to, that they think are not covered in the class that they may want to think about, and that will encourage them to do that. Yeah.
I think one of the biggest challenges is that there is making, to use a catchphrase, something like making learning visible, and that's usually used around assessment, but increasing the way in which folks can see learning happening, or can see other people learning, or can see professional practices that they're going to try to emulate to increase their, another catchphrase, horizons of observation. And if these things tend to happen behind closed doors, they have no way to model it because they don't know what it looks like. So the closer you get to a simulation, the more difficult this becomes because of the way that those become obfuscated. So it's a challenge that I think would eventually come up depending on the direction that you head.
So that's one of the tasks I'm interested in, is making it more of an online simulation. So particularly as classes get bigger.
Why would digitization solve this problem?
Or what problems would it solve?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, because, well, a lot of things I like about it is that they get around the table and they talk to each other and do a lot of things. But just kind of realities of large classes and things like that. So maybe being able to do it both ways and then comparing the two would be interesting.
So if it's large classroom, if it's large classes that are the issue, wouldn't it make sense to sort of split them off into subgroups and have each one of them be their own Fed system?
Yeah,
committees.
the picture that I showed you, that I actually did, the last time I taught it here, we had 3 different groups working together.
I guess I'm not sure how moving it online is going to alleviate that. What issues do you see that
I
would
mean,
potentially be addressed by it?
It sounds like it was just a thought, like a potential step forward.
Well, no, I mean, I'm curious because I'm wondering if there are things that I'm not seeing in it that, are there?
Yeah, it might help some students interact more, keep a record of the discussions and things like that we can review later on.
It's not my preferred way to go about it, but if you do sort of a task analysis and can break it down into component practices, that might be another thing to include in the sub parts of your class that are associated with the general activity. If you find that there are sub-activities, analyses, for example, or negotiation tactics, stuff like that.
I have also a problem here, that how much exactly of microeconomics, the knowledge, let's say, is used in these meetings by Feds to really conclude these decisions. Because we know there is a joke actually that they say if you give if you want a Hello World program to be written, if you give it to an undergrad student, they just start a compiler and they write a code which prints Hello World. If you give it to an executive, he will send an email to his somebody below and say, can you please write for me this program, and I want it by 5. So I want to say exactly how much of macroeconomics is really used in their decisions apart from politics and all these things that they do. So how much they really learn about, how much they have to know about macropolitics to make these decisions.
How much do they actually have to know?
Exactly.
Yes. How much do they learn? Those are sort of 2 questions that I would think about. And I would say that to make that decision, they don't have to know a lot. So that's why it's important to have a summary afterwards to be able to evaluate.
But then to make a decision that aligns with the actual Fed decisions, then you have to know significantly more, right?
Yeah.
I was gonna follow up his
Sure.
question. When you say simulation, it actually assumes all the time that you have the actual operation and the process you can verify what you're doing. Now, in this case, Federal Reserve System, I guess the meetings are all closed door and no proceedings or the minutes are reported or written down. I don't know.
Yes.
So in that case, students might be doing better job than Federal Reserve, actually. So how do you compare the pros and cons of or the merits of the students' activities in terms of the outcome? You can actually compare the outcome. Are they the same, or how do they come out?
Well, certainly there's sort of, because we meet right before the actual FOMC meeting, there's some immediate feedback, but it doesn't entirely address your very good question. The minutes come out several weeks later, and so they're more detailed.
Is it very detailed minutes?
Yeah, so they're very
Oh, I
detailed
see.
minutes
So you can actually compare.
yeah, so we kind of go into that to talk about it as well.
So how did the students work fair against the?
They tend to be more conservative. It's interesting.
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, so they will keep interest rates the same. It's almost always.
Which one, the students or the
The students are more conservative. The students are unlikely. Maybe because I was teaching it all during the 2007 2006, 2007, 2008, when the economy was falling to pieces, right? And they were like, no, we're going to keep interest rates the same. And meanwhile, the Fed's like slashing them, and so you know, maybe they don't.
Have you done it?
Perceive the difficulty.
To your point, have you ever done an analysis of, you know, I don't know if you keep notes from the classes themselves, right, from the in-class simulated meeting itself, but have you ever done any kind of a comparison between the actual Fed meeting notes and the conversations which went on in class? And what I would be interested in is understanding how do they align? And you said that there are 3 instances throughout the semester. Do they converge over the course of the semester? Because that I mean, if the Fed, you know, presidents are arguably experts in macroeconomics, then theoretically they should be, you know, the topics of conversation, the time frame is different, amount of information available is different, and everything like that, and certainly immersion in the topic. I mean, yours is one of, you know, 5 classes that they're focusing on, and the Fed, you know, the Fed chairs that, or the people involved are, you know, sort of live and breathe this. But do they converge? Do they come closer to thinking like one of the voting members? Do they come closer to that?
I don't really have the answer for you, because I haven't really done that, and it's, you know,
It might make for an interesting.
I've listed some of the, you know, I think the results of the simulation are, but in fact, actually, usually by the time we move into later parts of the semester, it's micro, we're doing pricing analysis and things like that. We move on to other topics. It is meant to be, you know, really kind of introduction to the economy, meant to really ground in the logic of supply and demand.
So I'm sorry, maybe I misunderstood. It was 3 rounds in the beginning, or is it 3 scattered throughout the semester?
Well, it really depends on where I'm teaching and the type of class. So it could be up to 3. Here, for the first one, we pretty much look at what they did in March, and then we actually go through the simulation in June. But even then, we're kind of coming back to it because we have to cover some other topics in the class. But I like what you're saying.
Because I mean, I thought it could be interesting to see, you know, sort of the effectiveness of, you know, of the teaching around it and of the training itself.
Right.
You know, I mean, like if they sit in and then can compare, you know, well, they had no idea, you know, they were talking about completely different things in this first iteration, and then in the second iteration, after they've been introduced to all these topics, they have a much better understanding of what it is that they need to look at, or what it is that others look at. Again, you know, we can get into arguments over whether they're expert at it or not, but I mean, you know, that's always the problem with grading.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, but what I mentioned about the Beige report that they look at comes out 2 weeks before, I don't think that they're operating under much less information than the bank presidents are. You know, so obviously, you know,
You don't think
bank presidents have been involved in.
You said you don't think that they're operating on much less, or
They
or
do.
you do?
The students are obviously
They are
under
operating
much
on
less than the bank president.
No, they're not.
Repeat.
They
No,
are
they're
not.
not. Yes, they
They're
are.
not,
He's
they're
saying
not
that
operating on much less.
They are not
information.
operating on much
They
less.
have
Okay.
a fair amount of the information that the Fed presidents have because of these reports that are coming out. Now, yes, okay, so the Fed presidents, they're sitting in their offices and they're talking with people from the community and things like that, so, yeah, so they're.
The Fed presidents, they're not always in that meeting, right? And they're not always spending all of their time just preparing for that meeting. What do they do outside of that? I mean, don't they?
Yeah, they're managing their own areas, right? But like I said, they're talking with people, they're going out making presentations, they are working with analysts, gathering information. because they are ultimately responsible for a lot of information in their particular area. And I'll go back to the book. Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, so there's all sorts of things like the employment services sector in that area, energy and mining, employment wages, banking and finance that they've got to be looking at, services, retail sales, real estate and construction,
Today.
consumer spending. These are sort of big categories that all the beige book.
So in terms of learning outcome, which I think is what we're talking about, how much students do their own work, which otherwise they would not have done? Was there some aspects of a mutual humiliation process which will force them to study? For example, what are the meanings of a certain data? What are the implications of doing something? I mean, assuming they're students, they will not have any idea about what the meaning of the data and how the data was collected and what the historical path was for using this kind of data. So do they really go into that and study themselves by reading whatever record?
We do usually have a test in there as well, so a test on basic information about money supply, banking, things like that. So there's a test as well, which is part of the class grade. But it is it's meant to be an introduction to it. It's meant to handle that problem of, instead of lecturing from that big Krugman book or whatever, to actually come up with some other way for them to understand the information, to think about the information, to do a little bit of research on it. So they have to research the bios and the areas. So that's something that they have to do.
I came in late, so I may have missed this, Anthony, but as an old, and I mean from junior high through college, I was an active participant in debate in forensics, policy debate, where you have a debate proposition, and then you have constructive speeches and rebuttals. And so my question is, how much in terms of what you teach them in learning outcomes, do you teach techniques to be used in a policy debate? Because I assume these meetings amount to these economists who are experts, in their field coming in, and it's a little bit like the Supreme Court adjourning, for a meeting, arguing back and forth on one side or another of a policy proposition that has at least two, maybe more side, policy outcomes. But,
Yes.
but there are techniques that I think our students can learn. I've used debate format in class with some success.
Do they vote or they argue and discuss?
We have the go-rounds.
So my question was,
Yeah, right.
to that, I guess.
Which relates to the go-rounds. They have to present the information and make their analysis, make their vote. And then we do the next one where they have to sort of justify what the vote is. So,
But there's no actual back and forth.
no, actually,
debate
there is.
There is.
Yes. And could we use more understanding of rhetorical debate skills and stuff? Yes, I think we probably could. But it is, they become the Fed president. They look at their area. They get a sense of at least, do we need more money? Do we need to improve the economy? Are we worried about employment, or are we worried about inflation? Right? Because those are pretty much the sort of two issues, and they just up the real Fed, they've got to make that decision for their area. And so.
Well, then let me follow up. You said that the students have access to as much information as the Fed officials would. So does the ability to evaluate evidence as being either credible, true, or dubious, does that enter in?
Yes, in terms of, you know, the Bloom taxonomy, you know, what we're saying about,
Mhm.
yeah, and it's sort of the cognitive domain, so, thinking about it, some intellectual capacity, knowledge, but also, you know, the other part, the psychomotor domain, so actually having the skills to debate, to express your opinion within a group, I think is an important part of it as well, so.
How is
and
grading achieved in this kind of dynamic? They just do it or they don't, or?
Yeah, they're primarily evaluated on those three different areas.
Okay.
So the bio report that they do, some of the beige book,
Mhm.
the report of the economic area, and then the final Fed summary analysis at the end. So it is primarily an analysis of their report. Thanks.
I was thinking, Dr. Larson, I think, has talked in the past about this peer evaluation software called Teammates, is that right? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
I was thinking, wed those together in an interesting synergy.
Yes.
Let the Fed pseudo board here say you did a good job today or you didn't do a good job today in your own talk. That'd be interesting feedback, because I imagine that's what they do to each other. Like that's the interesting part that swayed my my ability to think about this better or worse. This was an opaque discussion. Somebody might say, I don't like that at all. It didn't help me understand what I need to do. Or
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah. At NYU, we were kind of discouraged towards peer evaluation.
So the wider institutional environment matters for this flip learning.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Why is this a taboo topic, or why did NYU not like the idea of peer evaluation?
yeah, I think.
There was a bad experience with it in the
It's
past?
a bad experience.
Okay, I see.
Students complain about it. Students can harshly evaluate each other.
Well, it's important to talk about this in public, I think,
Yeah.
because we do understand what may happen to us if we attempt the same thing. I mean, that's.
Right.
Mhm.
So I think what you do then is,
Mhm.
you know, you give the opportunity to evaluate each other, but
Mhm.
you don't necessarily score up that high.
Yeah. Or you
Is that-
take that
I
as
you
think
do.
anything coming out of evaluation as a fear-driven motivation is so small
Yeah.
compared to the other side.
Mhm.
So I'm just imagining the fact that someone feels I'm inferior, and then I'll go back and study and be prepared. So next time,
Right.
I feel I'm proud of it. So this is what I'm looking at. I think I don't know the theories behind this, but let's say I was in technical expert situation several times. They assumed I was an expert. I was in a way, but I was only 20% prepared. So I had to read probably 10 times more document than anybody could imagine before I can stand on the trial and
Right.
then answer this question. So I think this is sort of marking that kind of situation, marking in the sense it's not real,
Yeah.
but there is a professor and there's a peer. So it's sort of a compulsory learning, which professor cannot impose.
Yeah.
You try to teach so much within 50 minutes or 75-minute period. You know all that. It's
Yeah.
just not enough.
Yeah.
So typically the students in the Oriental countries, and it includes actually USA, the way we teach in USA is just teach, they go back and
Right.
forget about 80% of them. So this one, they have to drive themselves to learn something. I think that's a very significant factor.
I like the peer pressure quality of it too. That's
what
kind of
Dr. Larson would be interested in is, can we really force the students in SUNY Korea to do that so that they can really not only enjoy, but we see the outcome of the learning would be probably 3 times more significant. not 20%.
Yeah, what
That's what I
Klaus
want.
Mueller, my predecessor as vice president, he made the comment, which I tend to agree with, that many of the students, at their age, some of them really could care less what the older professor, the authority figure, what his opinion is, but they care a lot about their peers. And so I found in using the peer evaluation tool, this teammates web application is really powerful. Versatile is the word. But I found that the students, I didn't get any real negative feedback on the use of that instrument, on the use of peer evaluation. Plus, I would challenge any professor here to clearly indicate how he or she is able to grade a class of, say, 50 students doing group-oriented work. It just doesn't happen. You cannot observe 5 or 6 teams and observe their interactions in enough detail. It's actually a better, more accurate method of assessment. This is my point of view. I was really curious about people who, like, I had the same question about NYU is why? Because the issue here is, and I think Professor Saul was getting at this, the issue is, what's the goal? The goal is learning. If the goal is learning, then there should be nothing wrong with letting students and teams take more responsibility for that to happen. Or internships, off campus, not in the classroom. I mean, this is not a loss of control for us. It's rather a step forward toward the ultimate goal of our education.
And as you said, the lack of ability of students to remember things.
Yeah.
I find multiple senses help people
The
remember
lecture
many
method.
things like this. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I taught the senior design class for about 10 years. 10 years times 2 semesters a year.
For senior students?
Senior
as in-
design. So
senior
design means with whatever they learned for 4-year period, you design a product and form the marketing strategy and the sales strategy and all that, and the profit statement. Usually the groups were in sizes of 5 to 8. You know what? I use a peer evaluation tool and let them evaluate, and anonymously, but there is a group leader they elect. The group leader is responsible for judging the fairness of their own peer evaluation. Always, out of say 7 or 8 groups I had, 1 or 2 groups had one member, at least one, sometimes 2, getting comments like, Mary Jane never participated. We tried to have her involved in the team and she never came, and so on. If I see that from everybody, what I do, I lower the grade by 1. If the group gets A, it becomes A minus. And so there's no objection, it's just very clear. So I think this is a kind of drive a peer evaluation does, and it improves their performance tremendously. And then during the presentation day, we always invite all the faculty. I mean, no more than 3 or 4 shows up, but that's okay.
Yeah.
They are kind of pressured.
anticipating
They
that, yeah.
have neckties and
Yes.
all set up in a real setup, and they look really professional. I say you should speak clearly, and I judge the PowerPoint and how you. So each and every student comes out and make a presentation. It's just a sort of a sales pitch. Aesthetics of a PowerPoint, not only the contents matter. So I had a great fun
a
out
simulation
of it. Yeah,
too.
and the students won many prizes out of that actual competition, national competition. So I think
That's great.
in this campus, some excitement is needed. I think we need to develop some sort of competitive spirit among themselves, not only against the Yonsei University, whatever, but just this is something. I think this is good.
I think just one question.
Yeah.
In that course, the groups were assigned by you, or they were?
No, they developed their own project, and then I
No, the group members.
Assignment to groups. Yeah.
oh
So you were assigning the
I
groups
randomly
yourself?
assigned.
Randomly
So-
assigned the
so did
members.
I.
yeah, I randomly assigned.
So did I, and a random assignment, because
Yeah.
if you don't, with a majority of Korean students, you know, they'll cluster together.
Yeah, they
according to-
congregate. This is
Yeah.
my friend and my girlfriend.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
usually a good boyfriend and get together.
Yes.
So no. In fact, I discourage any good friends to be in the same group unless it is accidental. So that kind of worked very interestingly, and I enjoyed it. And then what I learned is their creativity was probably 300% enhanced than you trying to teach them anything. They come up with some crazy idea, and I say usually, hey, are you sure? So one group, for example, tried to develop toys for babies with a learning disability. Believe it or not, there was a company who picked that idea, and they created a manufacturing line for that, and they made some money. So we think, you know, children with a, you know, learning disability and retardedness will be the same as usual. They're not. They created 3 different kinds of rabbits, one looking sad, one looking smiley, and the other one plain. They always pick the sad one. So isn't that interesting? So it's a sort of a product development skill, and the teacher would never have come up with this kind of idea. But this is the kids who said, we're gonna do this, you know. So I think we're talking about creativity in Korea in terms of IT and, you know, all this crazy novel technology which doesn't even exist right now. The point is, it's not the new technology which makes the money, but the old technology which nobody has recognized the potential for creating a product.
Well, that's the nature of innovation.
Yeah.
One recent example is this Stanford dropout who founded the company that just went public, Snapchat, and he was 21 years old, but the idea uses old technology. I mean, my own experience teaching back in the 20th century, and then I was late because we had a meeting with ambassadors. The Incheon Global Campus had a day to welcome ambassadors from a number of developing countries. So I had this luncheon conversation that actually related to, I was trying to explain to them how our teaching methods are different here than you might find at another university. But actually, I think any university that's alive and well in the 21st century, they're probably looking at this whole area, like the buzzword is flipped learning, but it's really innovative methods of teaching that use the tools of the 21st century without throwing out the baby with the bathwater and all the old tools. Because back to, you know, Anthony's presentation today, I asked the question about policy debate because it's quite apparent that the Fed, these are well-trained, highly trained, you could say, economists, so experts, so-called in the field. But when they get together to make, as a committee, to make their decision, those meetings are like a policy debate within closed doors, right?
Different parts of the country have different objectives. They've got different problems, and so
Yeah.
they might.
So,
And they
but,
do get into some debates.
yeah.
Or it's
some
like
go-
Donald Trump trying to learn politics in the real job.
Yeah.
You know,
Oh.
I got a meeting
Yeah,
today.
we've
so-
run over. People
And
can
he
leave if they
still-
want, but
And he still hasn't
Yeah.
learned yet.
Oh, he's
And he
learning,
may or
so
may not last.
I hope he learns fast.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got one last question, and we're obviously over, so that's good, I guess. If we're all still chatting, we're pulled by the topic. But please leave if you need to go. As coordinator, I'll just say that. Just if you need to go, it's fine. Thank you for coming. But one question: compare your classes that use these simulations to classes that do not. I mean, are there any objective ways that you talk about that those classes have better social dynamics or worse, or just a different kind of social dynamics? Have you noticed anything like that? This is something that interests me because that's what I've noticed when I do what I would now classify as flipped learning. I get a very different sort of culture in my class, and I'm not going to talk about several characters. I'll talk about it later in my talk, but which is in a few weeks. But have you noticed anything regarding the strict chalk and talk version versus a class that uses a lot more simulations or flipped
Yeah,
learning?
students got to know each other better.
Could
and work together. I think they had a much better grasp of the economy. And
Do they
definition
talk
of
about
economy.
different things too? I mean, like,
Yeah.
are they more
do.
willing to like disagree and like openly add things to? That's what I've noticed. I noticed they're not afraid to introduce something that I have not introduced to the professor. Like they'll bring things up more often. I notice if they're more comfortable knowing that, oh, this person agrees with me already in the class, I can talk about this. But if they're all individuals in the class versus you, the professor, it's basically always a one-on-one sort of challenge. And some people are very good with that. They're very resilient. They'll do that. And that's one skill, I think, that is good. But other people need that sort of helping, collective hand in the class. They have a friend that agrees with them, or they're not going to be stared at in silence. They understand that as interest and not as hostility. And,
Despite the fact it's a simulation, they work together. It's a lot of individual work.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah.
That
So,
one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a lot of individual stuff that they have to do. It comes together in the simulation, and we have some of the meetings before then where they're able to get to know each other and discuss some things.
Yeah.
It's a lot of individual work. So only towards the simulation do we have an opportunity.
The simulation itself is the interaction. That's just to give it a typology. I mean, the project itself is interesting because it is, like you said, a lot of individual things being done, but they're being done in the simulation. Whereas most people, I think about a group simulation as a group task, and that's like a group project, and they present as a group. But this is really a lot of individuals collectively presenting. Yeah, it's a good way, I think, of handling big classes too, instead of
And shortly after I started, I got my first teaching award.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
and I
Beautiful
know it
idea.
was because of this, right?
My wife,
It's
who
just
is
like-
Korean, she read a book about Jewish Havruta, which was the group learning of the Talmud amongst Jewish scholars that's done at most universities or any kind of place they train rabbi. And she gets teaching awards for that. They really enjoy pairing each other and learning, but that's a totally different topic. But also what she says, don't pair the same sex with each other. Don't pair females with each females because they start to get catty and they fight each other. And she says, don't pair males to males because they never listen to each other. What you do pair is males to females because they're always trying to impress each other. They always want to say something good to each other, generally. So she's savvy in using this kind of sexual pseudo-dating dynamic as roping it into the teaching environment. Not as a distraction, but suddenly, I need to make this person, approve of what I'm talking about.
Then the ratio has to be balanced.
Yes, it does. Yeah, and you probably couldn't teach this at a fully female or male school, of course, but yeah. So I mean, the context matters, but I just want to mention on the issue of this more energetic kind of group learning culture in the class. Definitely. Anytime I've done things like this, it's always
Yeah,
I love
because the alternative can be the same, can be said as well in terms of when you are teaching engineering, computer science kind of thingy, the male-female dynamics does not really work.
Mhm.
Male always dominate. Oh, I know better. You should do this. You should do that. So the learning outcomes on those group dynamics for the female students are always worse off.
Mhm.
I have seen that.
Really. Okay.
Yeah. So this is where gender segregated teaching sometimes
Keep
really
you
helps.
captive by
Yeah.
still using your computer. so
Because we are just
I-
carrying
I
over
had
the
to leave.
societal perception
Right.
that the guys are smarter when it comes to gadgets or numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen data related to that of following, you know, common interests and skills in earlier life. By the end of high school, they've sex stratified on topics.
yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay, we can close. Thank you, Dr. Pennings.
Thank you.